Thank you very much, Professor Wijesinghe, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I think most of our audience are from Sri Lanka, so good morning, everyone. And I also join Dr. Mansi in wishing everyone a happy Eid today, and hope you're all hope you're all safe and well. Professor Wijesinghe mentioned that about about him wearing a shirt. I am so thankful that the organizers didn't impose a dress code on us, because there was this webinar last week where I was told I would need to wear a blazer as that's the dress code, and I simply refused to participate in it. And I guess that's the new normal. But anyway, good morning everyone once again, and let me just share my screen and get to our presentation. I hope all of you can see it. Okay.
Yeah, we can see that.
Sorry, just give me a second. Okay, so I'm coming at this as a bit of an outsider in a sense. So I'm not from the planning practice or from the areas of expertise that many of you might be in. I'm coming at it from an economist perspective, and I really want to thank Jagat and the organizers for really wanting to be eclectic in this annual sessions and welcoming an interdisciplinary review. I think Jagat has been having an eye on some of the things that I have been interested in for some time, because even though I haven't published any academic research on this particular topic, it's an area that as an economist I've been curious about. So I'm certainly not an expert on it, but it's an area I've been curious about. And I have also been influenced by my interactions with folks who deal with this topic of the city and urban development in different ways. So a very close friend of mine who is an activist on forced evictions and urban inequality issues, then friends of mine who are in the real estate investment sector, and also my role in the private sector in a bank, where particularly things like land and real estate are taken as collateral, and really thinking about the impacts of COVID-19 on investment. Let me just see if the screen share. I'm just wondering if everyone can. Can everyone see my slides? I feel like you can't at the moment.
We can see your slide.
It's visible. It's visible. Let's go ahead.
You can see. Okay, great. All right. So in my presentation, just for completeness, I will share with you some thoughts on the global economy, so that you get a glimpse of that before I move on to some things that are more specific on urban and cities. So quick snapshot on the COVID-19 impacts on the global economy. Many of you might be familiar with this already, but perhaps out of interest. Then a quick snapshot on the economic implications for Sri Lanka, and then the implications for inequality, and then move specifically on to some thoughts on my thoughts on cities and urban development. So on the global economy, I think you and I both know now that that a recession is inevitable and the shape of recovery is uncertain. The global economy is set to shrink by 3% this year, which is a much steeper downturn than the Great Recession of 2009, which was just a minus 0.7 recession. There is estimates suggesting a partial rebound in 2021 of 5.8%, but we have to remember that's off a low base this year, and it will crucially hinge on the success of containment efforts all around the world, whether there's any signs of re-emergence, second wave, etc. But also it will hinge crucially on the success of the economic relief, recovery, and stimulus packages that countries are granting. Economists love to debate the shape of the recovery. It's an alphabet soup right now. Some are saying it's a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped, L-shaped, and so on. In my view, it will be more like, and think of the Nike swoosh logo, where it's like a tick, where we have a much longer time to get back to the pre-COVID.
Anushka, excuse me?
Yes.
Anushka?
Yes.
Now it's okay. Earlier we saw only the first slide, that's why. So now we are moving slides, right?
Yes, let me see why that's...
Right, okay. Okay,
let me see why that's an issue. There seems to be a line.
You can keep this like this and then move slide by one by one. Yeah, that's good enough. We all can see.
Let me do that. I apologize if you're having difficulty seeing it. Okay. Okay. So just to recap again, this is the picture of the global economy where recession is inevitable. I think I showed this to you. So the impacts on trade and on jobs. One of the harshest impacts will be on trade. And you can see that the volume of merchandise trade is expected to be quite sharply affected, falling exports across the world. There are, of course, more optimistic scenarios and pessimistic scenarios on the trade impact, but the long and short of it is that global trade is going to be substantially affected. On jobs, substantially high numbers on the estimates of jobs. Some numbers are closer to the estimate on what happened during the global financial crisis. But of course, the difference here will be perhaps prolonged impacts in terms of underemployment, not just unemployment. So you may still have your jobs, you're not technically unemployed, but you are given fewer hours, you have taken a salary cut, you're on furlough, or all these other different permutations of employment, and all of this leading to vulnerability. Some folks have asked me, what do we have reference points in terms of SARS or the global financial crisis in terms of the economic fallout of this? And on both cases, this time is different to both those. In SARS, SARS struck just a few years after China joined the WTO. China wasn't a systemic part of the global economy. It was just less than 5% of world trade, of world GDP. Now it accounts for over 17% of global GDP. So it's much more systemically important. So what happens in China, even though China is now more or less over the pandemic compared to some other countries, thereafter there's going to be sustained impacts. Also different to the global financial crisis in terms of the economic fallout, because unlike in that instance where it affected primarily the financial markets and then trickled out over time, this time COVID-19 has affected all sectors and all countries almost at the same time, and it's multiple shocks happening at the same time. The difference also is that post-GFC, global economic governance was a lot stronger. Countries, particularly the G20, which represents 85% of world GDP, came together and were able to mount a firefighting kind of response on the economy. Whereas this time, we are not seeing anything as close to that in terms of a coordinated response on the economics. And you can see different countries taking very different steps on the economy, and already tensions were high. Trade tensions were high, for instance, even before COVID-19. A few thoughts on inequality. I think we're seeing inequality in multiple dimensions, and especially inequalities that existed getting magnified. So across countries, there is inequality brought on by COVID, because better managed economies that did their economic reforms before, had taken prudent measures before, has done a lot to strengthen their economies, are much better able to weather this crisis than poorly managed economies that postponed their reforms and were already on a weaker economic footing. So you're seeing inequality in the COVID-19 impact across countries. Within countries, there are a lot of different impacts also. So larger businesses versus smaller businesses, formal sector employees versus informal employees, those who are registered to receive welfare even before COVID versus those that don't, and already underserved communities. And this is probably of relevance to the planning discipline and urban experts, where already underserved communities in a city, perhaps like the urban poor, versus those in better neighborhoods. So almost a lockdown of privilege, or in Sri Lanka, curfew affected different people very differently. Some were able to live very comfortably during this time, and others were very precarious. Some implications for Sri Lanka. So for Sri Lanka, it was a quadruple whammy in a sense, and the timing couldn't have been worse. So we had an external supply shock because of what happened with Chinese supply chains coming first. Then the external demand shock because of the lockdowns in our key markets like US, Europe, India, etc. And then on the domestic side, domestic demand shock and domestic supply shock when we had our own curfew. So quadruple whammy. Sri Lanka is going to see a fall in our exports, goods exports, except of course some segments like tea and spices will be okay, but our larger industrial exports like manufactured exports like apparel and so on will be affected. On the services side, tourism, international transport, port and shipping kind of stuff, and also remittances. Sri Lanka has become very reliant on remittances from overseas, and as a result of the low oil prices in the Middle East, a lot of our workers are in the Middle East, remittances will be impacted, and also our workers in countries like Italy and Korea are unable to go back, or potentially losing their incomes due to the economic effects there. And I think just to summarize the impact on Sri Lanka, it comes on the back of already weak GDP growth in 2019 of 2.3%, which is very low compared to many of our peers. We had the Easter Sunday, horrible Easter Sunday attacks which affected growth. So you're seeing this COVID-19 economic fallout coming on the back of already weak GDP growth. So let me move on to some of my thoughts on cities and urban development. And again, this is some of my thoughts coming from a bit of an outsider as an economist, and not as someone who has urban as a discipline. So I look at it from the point of view of trade, investment, economic competitiveness of the city, innovation, and also economic inequality. I think while physical distancing is a vital response to COVID-19, physical proximity is also what typically makes cities engines of economic growth. And the way in which this pandemic influences the evolution and competitiveness of cities would be an important issue for planners to think about. So let me share some thoughts on 4 aspects of 4 dimensions of economic impacts. So sectoral impacts, people on vulnerability, on economic activity, and on finances and investment. So on sectors, Sri Lanka's growth model in recent years has been highly reliant on what economists call domestic non-tradable sector. Categories like mixed property development, real estate, leisure, and so on. And this has been a segment that most of our foreign direct investment has come into. And it's been one of those sectors that have boomed post-war. And this is precisely also a sector that's going to be severely affected due to lockdown, due to the collapse in retail and leisure, and due to the halting of construction projects for a few months. So in terms of sectoral impacts, that's an example of how our economic vulnerability and sector vulnerability comes into play even in a COVID-affected environment. And the second aspect in terms of people, I think we all know, and Dr. Mansi already brought this dimension in about informal workers. I think the impacts are obvious. All of us have been trying to be quite conscious of the impact on informal workers in our cities and urban centers. And in terms of housing issues also, most low-income households live in 1 or 2 rooms, work is largely informal, social safety nets like sick pay or unemployment benefits, medical insurance may not even exist, and social distancing is infeasible, right? And take a look at any of these so-called high-rises that have been built by the government, where folks in underserved settlements some of them were evicted, some of them were given the option to move into these government-built buildings, which have essentially become high-rise slums, and there's no prospect of social distancing there. And even among these certain informal workers in the city, remote work is an illusion, right? Remote work is only an option for a minority of us who can take advantage of that. Another aspect of people's vulnerability is different. It's the pressure on rural job creation, because we've seen in places like India, but also in Sri Lanka, return migration out of the city, out of urban into rural because of the pandemic. Some may not want to return because they're worried that it's the cities that have had the highest number of cases. At least in Sri Lanka, 2 districts are still under a different form of curfew to all other districts. So there may be pressure on the rural economy to generate more jobs to absorb these folks who have returned and don't go back to urban centers. In terms of changing economic activities, in the opening line of a seminal paper by Edward Klesser and others, they state that, and I quote, "The future of the city depends on demand for density." And the authors argue that this demand does not only come from jobs, but people are also attracted to the range of goods, commercial, aesthetic, public goods, etc., and provide. So the question I guess we have to ask ourselves is, will COVID-19 change this? Worries about our health could impact our leisure choices, shopping, cinemas, food courts, and so on. So what does this mean for the type of economic activities that have typically come to dominate a city like, say, Colombo? What does it mean for projects like Shangri-La Mall? What does it mean for entertainment things like Excel World with its bowling alley? What does it mean for Golf Face Green as an open public space? What does it mean for Vihara Mahadevi Park as an open public space? So I think thinking of how these economic activities would change or not. And there would be differentiated decisions being made by different demographies, right? So because of the age vulnerability of this disease, older people may be less keen to engage in some of these activities for some time. So again, the markets, the micro markets that are there in different parts of our city, different types of economic activities will be influenced. And the fourth aspect of the economic impacts that I want to talk about is on finances and investment. So 2 aspects of it, on public finance and private investment. So on public finance, I think the impact on the exchequer in countries like Sri Lanka and what that means for publicly funded urban improvement programs. Already the fiscal position in Sri Lanka is precarious. The exchequer is stretched, and the resources available for publicly funded urban improvement programs will be very challenging. So then does it mean, is prospects for further debt, or looking at more or different types of financing options to meet urban investment needs, like private-public partnerships for public housing and waste management rather than it coming through the national budget. But then the questions arise of, we know that there have been poor PPP deals around the world around public infrastructure. So do the government agencies dealing with these areas, and sometimes even local authorities, do they have the capability to strike good PPPs that make sense for both parties? So I think that's a whole thing to talk about. And also the erosion of local authorities' tax base and the impact that has on provision of local services in cities as well as towns outside. So for example, in places that local authorities in Sri Lankan towns that rely largely on tourism activities, and the taxes and fees they collect from that would be hugely impacted. And what does that mean for their own ability to spend on livability in their towns, Pradesh, Sabas, local and other local authorities? So that's the public side. On the private investment side, I think this short to medium term fall in real estate prices and subdued returns to urban real estate projects will be something quite stark. And also this also affects the banking and finance sector, since real estate is a key form of collateral. So I think, yes.
2 minutes?
Sure.
Two more
let me move. Certainly. Let me move on to my final slide, where I put forward some ideas for 5 aspects for rethinking. And the first is rethinking, and this flows from my previous slide. So rethinking vulnerability in cities. I think we need to hugely rethink how we deal with vulnerability and cities. We clearly saw how inequalities in housing, for instance, in Colombo was magnified, Colombo and the Western province, I guess, was magnified during COVID and curfew. Very little to no possibility of social distancing, poor design of housing, public housing projects that have been done recently, sometimes totally unfit for living at the best of times, made worse by the disease outbreak. And we know that in settings like that, these urban communities are disproportionately affected. And I think when I think about rethinking vulnerability in cities, what we have to really focus on is when one part of our city is vulnerable, we are all vulnerable. When one part of the city has poor access to safety, water, sanitation, and hygiene, we are all unsafe. So unlike before, where maybe parts of the city, you can kind of almost ignore and say, okay, that will happen in its own way, and everybody else can get about on their own. I think a disease outbreak necessarily makes all of us almost equal, and we are vulnerable because of each other's vulnerabilities. So really rethinking this aspect. Also within this, moving on, I think the other is rethinking of the city's design due to sectoral shifts. So 2 examples in that. IT. So one is the focus on large campuses and large IT parks for the IT sector has suddenly been totally flipped on its head. Many companies in Sri Lanka, just like overseas, have realized they can deploy more than 50% permanent work from home even after the pandemic. They've realized how much they can cut down on their real estate footprint. This has big implications for real estate investment, obviously, but big implications for planners too. What does agglomeration really mean anymore? Which sectors will actually need it? I think that's being debated. Similarly, on retail is another sector aspect of it. Retail storefronts. We've seen online shopping through companies like Amazon is booming as high street shops close already. And same is true in Sri Lanka of our local vendors and merchants suddenly coming online. And we are likely to see some permanent shifts beyond the immediate shifts. And this presents a public policy challenge, since high street shops anchor public spaces and have considerable social value. So, what are the implications of all these, some sector shifts due to COVID and the impact on the design of cities? The third aspect is rethinking the metrics for competitiveness. So economists have been talking about competitiveness of cities for some time. The World Economic Forum even had a council on this. indices and indicators of competitiveness, I think, will certainly need to be rethought and adjusted, because now necessarily it must include issues of health, ability and responsiveness to disease outbreaks. These were not there in the models of competitiveness of cities. And I think it's essential because that's the key aspect that has come out. I think I found it also very interesting that I believe it's the city of New York or the state of New York has a full-time epidemiologist on its key staff, constantly thinking about how the city needs to, how the city's competitiveness is affected by a potential disease outbreak. Fourth, rethinking the role of innovation in planning. I think innovation in the planning practice cannot be seen in isolation, and part of this innovation will have to be better capabilities for data-driven decision-making, right? So knowing the demography, economic activities, occupations, household income and expenditure, and poverty patterns in different parts of the city at a very granular level, so that at any one time you can overlay these with disease vulnerability metrics in order to be prepared in the time of an outbreak, and kind of come up with risk maps and heat maps and so on. So a lot more data. But I really don't want you to think that I'm only thinking of data as the innovation part of it, because I think there's been an overemphasis on this idea of smart cities being all about digital and data. And in my mind, a smart city is a city that has balanced the economics and commercial dynamism of a city with the needs for social, environmental, and individual well-being. It's not just deploying tech all over the city that makes it smart. And finally, I think rethinking investment modalities. So mobilizing private sector investment for urban development will be challenging due to the low returns in the medium term, short to medium term due to COVID. So we'll need to look at new instruments for building up infrastructure, PPPs, as well as for real estate projects, things like real estate investment trusts, REITs. Regulators have shunned this for some time, and I think they really need to look at REITs and the regulatory environment to make things like REITs possible. So I'm going to end there, and I really hope that I gave something thoughts for all of you to think about, and I'm happy to have you push back on any of these ideas or add to these ideas. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rohan, for that very interesting question. So I think the first answer is a short no. I'm not submitting that those same strategies will work, certainly. And in fact, what these prices do is that you go from a certain status quo to something that's different, and different economic actors realize what needs to be done differently. So if you just put on a pure economic lens, the strategy that was adopted during the Great Depression of the 1930s was highly, it was essentially a trade war, right? Where all countries put up trade barriers, and we saw everybody losing out as a result of it. And I agree with you, it's a phrase that I've really come to dislike, this new normal, but I guess the new normal that emerged from that was everyone realizing that global economic cooperation was for the better, and you had the emergence of the Bretton Woods institutions, etc. So that was the new normal to that response. Global financial crisis, we had a status quo caused the crisis. The new normal that emerged from that was greater financial sector regulation, greater focus on how public money is deployed to rescue corporates and banks, whole new regulatory framework coming in around those instruments, etc., etc. So that was it. This time, I think, again, we had a certain normal, if you will. And in my mind, what emerges after that will be different. And it's true some of the things you said, where health will be put at the center of decision making, whether it's at a urban design level or at a macroeconomic level, because suddenly you're realizing that you need to free up sufficient fiscal resources to match the health response, and prioritization will need to happen. So I guess to your point, I think it won't be the same strategies. It's just that new things will emerge, and a lot of the things that Dr. Mansi said will need to be considered. It's kind of nice to see a lot of different countries, and even at the city level, using this opportunity, using this moment in time where we've had this crisis to rethink and really say we don't go back to where it was. A lot of this phrase building back better or getting back to where we were. Not thinking of it like that, but moving forward in a way that's different to how we were using this opportunity. I hope that even in Sri Lanka, we use this opportunity to do something different as part of our recovery process, whether it's on economic policy or whether it's in the specific things we're talking about today around planning and urban development, rather than trying to quickly make up for lost time and going back to the trajectory that we were on. So yeah, that's just some thoughts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting, because when you were earlier making a presentation also, I was thinking that we always try to compare this, we are trying to compare COVID with so many other things. In Sri Lanka, we try to compare this with tsunami, we try to compare with the war and various kinds of things. We could not understand actually the inherent qualities within what are the real problems in it. Actually, we never try to understand that, but we were just trying to find answers without understanding the problem. This has been most of the issues in terms of planning, in terms of many other issues. Rather than looking at the problem, we find a solution. Right? That's why I call that we are very much into what I think, Mansi, you had that particular word in your slide somewhere. Development is overrated, you said. Yes. That is exactly what it is. We all think, okay, development, fine, no problem. Information technology, smarts, everything. I'm teaching pretty young kids, right? So, and when they are talking about all these smartphones and everything, I always tell them, guys, look, when we were young, we were smart, so we did not need smartphones, right? So I mean, anyway, coming back again, Anushka, there is another question for you, right? So the question, it doesn't say who is asking the question, but question is, what's the impact of COVID-19 on employability in developing countries like in or Sri Lanka or something like that? If I would like to add a little bit, what's the impact on employability, and is there something planners could do about it? I think you touched that. I want you to re-emphasize that a little. Anushka.
Thanks for that question, Sheeta. I mean, it's a big one that, it's big even in the context of this discussion, but certainly even in the context of the larger economic discourse, it's a big one. So let's take a stab at it. So there's a larger issue of what will happen with employment, employability, underemployment as a result of COVID-19 for countries like ours. But to try and bring it in the frame of today's conversation about planning and urban development, I think the big implication and impact will be how we see the informal sector, both from an economic justice point of view, which is a larger conversation, but specifically from the point of view of who is the city for? How designing of public services, open spaces, public housing for who? I think if we don't begin to solve that differently, it's going to affect employability or employment across our cities and urban centers, because it's going to go to the heart of that question of economic competitiveness of our cities and vulnerability, because we will have pockets that are underserved from public services, water, sanitation, health aspects, which makes the rest of the city vulnerable, which then makes us more vulnerable as a whole to, let's say, disease outbreaks, and then in turn affects employability prospects for everyone. So that's one. The other is in terms of employment and employability, moving in a different segment, not the informal workers and those who are working manual labor and so on, but also even more elite professions in the services sector, COVID-19 impacts will, there'll be a whole segment of folks who wonder, hey, this work from home has been great. My company is trying to take a policy decision to make part of us permanently work from home. Do I even need to live in the city? I have been longing for a nicer environment to live in. You have connectivity to outside centers. I know personally, myself and some friends of ours, we've really been thinking about where, do we want to, where would we like to live? What matters most in our lives and our daily lives? And we've been, there is certainly a rethinking about where folks want to live and have families and commute and so on. So I think the COVID-19 impact on working patterns, like work from home, will certainly have an impact on decisions around how people interact with the city, what use they have for the city, commuting or not, living in the city or not. So yeah, some fewer thoughts all over the place, but I hope you saw how they strung together. But I mean, it's a big question you asked, so you got me also thinking about it. I don't have a fixed answer today. Maybe it's a topic for further discussion.